Namaste, and welcome everybody to this evening's Bhagavad Gita discussion. Tonight we're going to be discussing chapter 3 of the Bhagavad Gita, continuing what Nayaswami Devarshi began last week. If you remember 2 weeks ago, when we were discussing the Bhagavad Gita, we finished chapter 2. And chapter 2 was about the secret of right action. And we described in chapter 2, summarizing right action, as that action which draws us away from the senses and away from the engagement in the outer world through the senses. And right there, just because Krishna is speaking about that, of going very directly talking about withdrawal from the senses, it is an indication that he was speaking of the deeper teachings of this Bhagavad Gita, being the battle between the forces, the lower forces and the higher forces within our very own being, just because he was speaking very directly to that. So we finished chapter 2, and then Devarshi ji last week began talking about chapter 3. Krishna and Arjuna, in their discourse, Arjuna asked Krishna, he says, well, if your advice to me is to withdraw from the outer world, why do you want me to fight this battle? And so here we find ourselves, yes, get away, as Krishna says, from this world of Maya, this world of delusion. Okay, we get away, but yet I'm being asked to fight this battle, which just seems to be very outward. And so in chapter 3, Arjuna wants clarification. He says, why you're asking me to do this battle? I act outwardly. And Devarshi began last week with the first few stanzas of chapter 3 in the Bhagavad Gita, and we're going to continue with another 4 or 5 this evening, because they comprise a segment, and when then the discussion begins to change. So I'd like to read the sections in the Gita that we'll be discussing this evening, and then we'll come back and speak a little bit further about them. I'll begin perhaps a little backing up one or so to stanza number 4. Actionlessness cannot be attained by mere inaction. One who forsakes work in the name of divine aloofness from activity cannot reach perfection. No one can remain actionless for even a moment. All are compelled by nature, whether willingly or unwillingly, to be active, driven by the gunas of nature. The person who restrains his organs of action, but in whose mind rotate the thoughts of sense objects, is regarded as a hypocrite and is self-deluded. That man, however, succeeds supremely, O Arjuna, who disciplines his senses by an effort of mind, remains inwardly non-attached, and engages his organs of activity in God-reminding activities. Perform those actions which your duty dictates, for action is better than inaction. Without action, indeed, even the act of maintaining life in this body would not be possible. And then finally, on this very same subject, he concludes with stanza number 9. Actions performed for selfish gain are karmically binding. Therefore, O son of Kunti, perform your duty without attachment, in a spirit of religious self-offering. So what Krishna is saying here, essentially, he said it 2 or 3 times very strongly, in this world, in a sense, actionlessness is impossible. Everything we do is action. There's some action involved in it. And by that, what we mean is we are engaged in it. We are doing something. It is a action that engages our will. Even, as Paramahansa Yogananda said, even when we sleep, that's an engagement of our will. Is there some seed thought? There is some seed element of will. If we didn't have that seed of will, this body would not be able to exist in this world of relativity, outward physical world. Even when we're meditating, when we're sleeping, when we're breathing, even if you think that you're not breathing by the use of your will, but even in that, there is a slight seed thought of will there. And you could sum this up by saying, as long as we are thinking and living our lives as I am the doer, you are performing action. You cannot be in the actionless state. And you could say, as long as I am the doer, you are motivated by ego. It's that ego is the soul identified with the body. And when we act in this world from ego motivation, we are in the world of karma. Karma rules. Now, karma rules, of course, whether we are engaged or identified or not, but yet that karma sticks to us, and that it sticks to the, you might say, the ego is the pole or the vortex around which the ego, which action revolves around. And like a vortex, it draws things to the center, and that center pole is the ego, as long as we are identified with this body. And so in yoga, we speak about what the goal of yoga is to overcome or to transcend that identity that I am the doer. If we can reach that state of consciousness where we feel that God is the doer, then you could say that then there is no action, because there's no I involved there. And so consequently, as long as there is that sense of I, there's always going to be action. And in this world, when there is action, what is there? Reaction. Action is as Isaac Newton said in his laws of motion, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction in the other direction. And so this is a basic law of nature. And in this world of relativity, karma rules supreme. There's no way around karma. Now, we can mitigate karma and we can overcome karma, but yet karma, whenever in the physical world or in the created world, karma rules. Now, you could think of it as, think of throwing a pebble or a small stone into a very large lake, very calm lake. You throw that stone in there, and from that point where it hits the lake, it begins to send out ripples in all directions. Well, so it is with us. Many, many, many stones going into that lake, each of them sending out ripples, each ripple interacting with the other ripples, until eventually a very, very complex pattern is created. What we need to do, of course, is we need to calm that lake. We need to calm those ripples and be able to not create those ripples in the first place. And that is the goal of yoga, why we practice yoga. We overcome the likes and the dislikes of the heart, that chitta, that reactive process of the heart. So if we accept the fact, I think this is where chapter 3, it starts, in the very first stanzas in chapter 3, it starts, we must accept the fact that we live in this world of karma. And if we live in this world of karma, in the sense of we live in the world of ego identification, of I am the doer, we must accept that karma rules and then work accordingly and in cooperation with that. And you might say also, put ourselves to the task to overcome that obstacle or overcome that ego identity. So if we say we are ruled in this world by karma, we find ourselves subject to karma, we must act. The question really comes down to, what do we do about it? How can we act? If we must act in this world, what is the right way to act? And this is what Krishna is embarking on in this chapter 3. What he gave it, you might say, the internal process in chapter 2, and now he's going to tell us why we must act, and perhaps also give us clues of how to act. Now he begins that in stanza number 7, and he gives a clue in stanza 7, and very concisely defines 3 ways that what we should do, what is the devotee to do in the process of fighting this battle. The first thing he says is we need to discipline the senses. And of course, he went into this very more extensively in chapter 2. But here again, he mentions discipline the senses. Now, this is something that when people practice yoga and they understand a little bit about it, it's a very familiar thing. But when we approach disciplining the senses, we need to use some common sense. We shouldn't be violent in our discipline. Some people, when they approach the yogic path or the spiritual path, they eat too much. They say, I'm not going to eat, and then they go on long fasts, or perhaps they have some habit that is involved in some other sense activity, and I'm going to abstain from that, and they go violently in the other direction. And you find people that the traditional austerities, I'm going to hold my hand in the air for a long extended period of time, or some other sort of tapasya that one might go through in order to whip those senses into shape. In the old days, in the Western tradition, the monks would wear these shirts made out of hair shirts, they were called. They were very rough, and if you wore them, they'd chafe the skin and very uncomfortable, I'm sure. But or they would scourge themselves, or in some way like that. That's not what is meant. Krishna wasn't speaking that way, but this idea of overcoming the senses by beating them is not going to be the way that we want to go about it. Because what happens when we do that? When we do violence to ourselves in that way, yes, we might be able to subdue something for a while, but imagine you have a servant and you start beating that servant. Well, the servant may obey for a while, but sooner or later that servant's going to rebel. And you might think of your senses as that. They're servants, but they can be good servants. We want to treat our servants with respect and have them do their duty as what they're intended for. And so you give them their due. And as Sri Yukteswar says in the autobiography of a yogi, he says, throw the dog a bone. Now that didn't mean to indulge the dog overly, but don't do violence to them, because in the long run, it usually doesn't work. And there tends to be a reaction. A person goes a long direction in that way, and all of a sudden they find that they haven't really overcome what is the real cause of their problem with the senses of inwardly, the mind, the feeling, the attitudes within. They've only stopped the stream outside expressing. And just doing that, sooner or later, the water behind the dam begins to rise, eventually overflows the dam, washes it away. You often find that this overreaction begins to happen. So we want to work with our situation, work with the senses, and slowly begin to moderate, live a balanced life, is what all the yogis say. All true spiritual teachings say, live the balanced life. Now, when I say balanced life, some people interpret that as, well, I'll do a little bit of sense indulgence and a little bit of meditation, sense indulgence, meditation. I don't mean it that way, but I mean bring yourself into a state of moderation in whatever moderation in all things. Now, the real deeper teaching of disciplining the senses, of course, is not outwardly so much looking at it from that perspective, but yes, we have to start there. But it's inwardly disciplining the senses, is what Krishna spoke about earlier, is learning to withdraw that life force from the senses. That's the real way we discipline them. Take that energy and pull it back inside and uplift it upwardly. Now, this brings us, and you could say, to another topic, and you might say the second, it's related also to the second piece of advice that in stanza number 7 that Krishna gives. He says, discipline the senses, but also be inwardly non-attached. Action without the desire for the fruits of action, nishkam karma, that is one way of expressing that, but not to be attached to the fruits of what you're going to do. Now, some people, when they hear that, they say, well, what's my motivation? Why would I do anything if there's no reward at the end for it? Well, we're not saying to not seek happiness or not seek joy, but we're saying whatever you're working for in life, don't be attached if things change. We live in a world of change. What happens nicely today is perhaps the sun is out, tomorrow it might be raining. And you see, don't get attached to outwardly. And if you act, don't act with that ego motivation of personally be satisfied. Now, how to do this, of course, is the trick. Now, how to do it? What is the trick to this? Well, I think this could be summed up in the third piece of advice that Krishna gives. He says, discipline the senses, don't be attached, and do God-reminding activities. That's the third one on the list. If you have a positive upward goal, do God-reminding activities, something positive, because it's very difficult to just deny oneself, to take away, in other words, to take away one's satisfactions in life, to do things that are difficult, to discipline the senses, unless you have also something positive to compare it to. So, as I think I may have said in my previous class, Paramahansa Yogananda used the image. He says, if you want to, he says, enjoy, once you taste good cheese, you won't have a taste for stale cheese any longer. So if we have a positive direction to our endeavors, if we begin to feel joy in our life, then we're not going to want those things that are lesser. So experience something that's higher in your life, and you'll find that the attachment to those things that are lesser will naturally begin to fade away. You just won't want them anymore. This is more the positive way, rather than you might say the negative way is meditate, love God, be positive, be joyful, and you'll find just naturally you'll begin to experience those things in your life, and without being drawn out to all these other diversions. You could say that if you want to overcome, you might say that karma, probably the best thing to do is don't create it in the first place. Now, of course, here we are, and we're in this body, so when something was created a long time ago that we're having to work ourselves out with. But the real secret of the spiritual path is not so much worrying about past karma. You often hear people talk, my karma is this, my karma is this. And Yogananda Ji would say, karma, karma, karma. People talk about karma. I don't want to hear about karma, because it is what it is. And if you've created something in the past, that's your karma to deal with it. The real secret is, what are you going to do about it in the future? The past lives of all men are dark with many sins, as Swami Sri Yukteswar said. It's what we do in the future. Positive spiritual effort now will determine what happens to us in the future. So do positive things now. It's the pendulum is always swinging. When we put it into motion, it'll find that it comes back again and swings back. Now, this is, you could say, those three things that I mentioned, doing positive deeds, positive activities. If we're embodied in this physical body, we have an ego, we're identified with the body, so we're acting. Even sattvic action is ego motivated to the degree that we think that I am the doer. There's waves. It's like karma, and our acting and putting things into motion, as I mentioned, is like throwing a pebble in the pond. It creates these waves. But with a big ego, large waves are created. But when we begin to overcome and transcend the ego, it's like small pebbles going in, and the waves are just a little bit. So when we do God-reminding activities, what that's doing is sattvic action too is binding, but it binds us less, and it's much easier to overcome. It's much less disturbing, and it allows the soul to be able to, allows us to meditate, to be able to be closer to God. And so if we do God-reminding activities, where we find that the ego itself is moderated in its outward expression, and then it becomes easier to overcome. I mentioned how Master Yogananda would say, karma, karma, people talk about my karma. And I notice in my life too, people often will ask me questions, and they'll talk about how can I overcome this bad karma? What did I do in my past life? I have this bad karma, or what can I do to get good karma? And you're thinking in terms like that. And it's a little bit like a merchant in a sense that if I do these activities, perhaps if I give some donations here and I do some good service there, I'll be able to garner good karma and for future life and this type of thing. Well, certainly that's certainly better to do that than to not do it. But we don't want to buy our way, and that's not the proper attitude, because it's you might say action with the expectation of rewards instead of that non-attachment of acting without the expectation of the fruits of your action. But people often approach karma in this way. But honestly, I sometimes answer people like that. I says, karma is neither good nor bad. It just is. It's karma. It's what we do with that karma that makes it good or it makes it bad. The very same karma can have a very opposite effect for different people, and it just all depends on circumstances. And those circumstances often depend how we interpret that karma as our own attitude. There's a story that illustrates this I'd like to share. There was once a king who liked to go hunting. And when the king would go hunting, he would take his vizier or his prime minister, his chief council person, with him out on the hunting with them. So one day the king and the prime minister went out hunting on horseback, and they went quite far from the castle, the realm, and they found themselves surrounded by bandits. Now, the bandits surrounded them and captured them. Well, and they captured them, and now these bandits belonged to a certain sect of bandits that demanded human sacrifice. And so they began to think who they were going to sacrifice. So they took the prime minister and they were about to sacrifice him. And but they looked at him and they saw that he was missing one of his fingers. The band. I got the story mixed up. The king, prior to going hunting, and he was out with the prime minister. Sorry about that. I have to retell the story. He was out hunting with the prime minister, and he was hunting, and he shot an arrow. And in the process, his hands became entangled with shooting the arrow, and he lost one of his fingers. Well, in losing one of the fingers, the prime minister said, "Well, sire, everything is for the best. It all works out for the best." Now, in his pain, the king was not very happy to hear that everything works out the best. He says, "I've lost my finger. How can I possibly this be for the best?" And he says, "Well, sir, everything works for the best." Well, the king became so angry with the prime minister, he threw him in the dungeon. Well, the prime minister ended up in the dungeon, who usually went hunting with the king. But that day, because he was imprisoned, the king went out by himself and was caught by those bandits I mentioned when I first started to tell this story. The bandits, they demanded human sacrifice, and they began to sacrifice the king. Well, just before they sacrificed him, though, they looked at his hand, and he was missing one of his fingers. And they saw that he was an imperfect sacrifice, and they said, "Well, we cannot sacrifice him because he's missing a finger, and that would be improper to give the goddess, this sacrifice." And so what they did is they took him back and they ransomed him back to the kingdom, and the ransom was paid, and he was able to survive in that way. And so he went down to visit his prime minister, who was in the dungeon, and the king by this time was repentant. He said, "Well, I guess you were right. Everything did work out for the best by my losing the finger. But then he says to the prime minister, but it didn't work out for you. It wasn't for the best. You ended up in prison. And the prime minister says, yes, sire, that's true. But you see, it did work out for the best because I have all of my fingers. And of course, he would have been sacrificed. Well, it did work out for the best. Well, this is how you find it with karma. Karma is like this. Karma for one person may end up being bad for that person, and that's seemingly bad for that person, but quite good for another person. And you find that what comes to us is not good or bad. What comes to us is what is ours. It's something that we have created in the past, and you could say that that karma is a gift coming back to us because it's being fed back to us that we might learn some lesson, something we put into motion, a lesson that needed to be learned is teaching us through that karma coming back to us. There was that other story, and this is one that was related by Swami Kriyananda, and he had met either, I think, relatives of this very saintly woman in India, young girl at that time, who had the power to heal people. She spent her time by herself in her room, and her family allowed her to be there because they recognized her saintliness and very rarely came out. She prayed to God in her room, and she prayed for other people to be healed as part of her activity, sadhana. And people were healed. And so they asked her to pray for her father, who was very ill, debilitated, was somewhat handicapped. And so they said, you pray for all of these other people, but you don't pray for your father. And the father himself was something of a pious man. He was a good man, but he was handicapped and he couldn't move about. But she said, no, I don't wish to pray for him. I think it'd be better if I don't. But families being as they are, they put quite a bit of pressure on her to pray for the father, until finally she gave in to the pressure and she said, okay, I will, but you'll see. And so she did pray for the father, and he overcame his illness, and now he was in good health, regained his mobility. But now that he had regained his health and mobility, he was able to indulge himself into all those things that he had been prevented from doing before. And because he had been prevented from doing them before, he had turned his attention towards spiritual matters and improving himself inwardly. But now those restraints were gone, and he indulged himself in all sorts of activity that were not very good for him, and lived a dissipated lifestyle. Well, you see, was that good karma, or was it bad karma that he had been handicapped in the first place? On the one hand, you could say his family, of course, thought it was bad karma. But really, perhaps it was his good karma, because it gave him that opportunity to strengthen something in his life. So when we look at karma that's in our life, coming or going, don't think of it in terms of good or bad. It's how we relate to it. So whatever comes of itself is why Swami used to say, and I probably was quoting Paramahansa Yogananda on that, whatever comes of itself, let it come. And this is what we were speaking about in another discourse recently. Accept what comes. But accepting it doesn't mean supinely, or doesn't mean passively. It means accepting it as yours. You own that karma because it was you who put that karma into motion in the first place. And if we take it in the right spirit, we take it as a lesson that I can learn from this. And so if you were to look at it in terms of attitude, the first thing is to learn to accept that which comes to you in life as yours. And even further, if you wanted to take this to a little bit higher octave, is you would not only accept it, but you would appreciate it as well, because you would see, yes, this is mine, and this has come to me for whatever purpose, so that I might be able to learn. And if you could say even cherish it in that way, be grateful for it, if you're the wise person who can then look deeply, intuitively, and see what the lessons are. So you're in a situation right now of your own making, and You can accept it and be grateful for it and make the best of it, or you can reject it. But if you reject it, you're merely putting it off. You're merely waiting for another day. The best is to transcend it. And to transcend it is to deal with it, do the appropriate attitude and response to whatever comes to you, and then let it go and let it go, and then you're free from it. There was if some of you read, there's a very nice blog that Nayaswami Devi puts out, writes, and Nayaswami Jyotish. Every week one of their blogs come out, and if you write to ananda.org, you can sign up for it, and it'll come to you in your email. But she wrote one today that I just read. And she told a story which I had read and heard of a long time ago of Lahiri Mahashaya, but it reminded me of that story. And this is the story of Lahiri Mahashaya, where he was walking back from the Ganges, from his morning bath there in Varanasi. And as he was walking back to his home, he was with one of his disciples, and he asked the disciple to please tear a piece of cloth off of his dhoti, that he was going to need it because he was going to be injured and would need that. Tear it off. And the disciple didn't pay attention or didn't think about it and didn't understand what was being asked of him, so he didn't do anything. But shortly thereafter, Lahiri Mahashaya was walking on a building, and if you've been to his home or in Varanasi, the old part of town, the very narrow lanes, a brick had fallen, fell from a wall, and hit him, glanced on him, and bloodied his toe. Knocked his toe and bloodied his toe. And so Lahiri Mahashaya, seeing the blood coming, took a piece of his own dhoti, ripped that dhoti, and wrapped his toe up to stop the wound, stop the blood. And the disciple didn't know quite what to make of it. And he says, well, sir, if you knew that was going to fall, why didn't you avoid it? And he said, well, he says, it was destined, Lahiri Mahashaya, to happen. And if I would have avoided what was destined, it would have come at another time in the future, but with interest. It would have come back with interest. And oftentimes it's like that. Now, of course, Lahiri Mahashaya, he personally, he didn't have, you say, well, what was it? Was it his karma to have his foot bloodied? No, it wasn't his karma in terms of Lahiri Mahashaya. It may have been the karma of this body, but you see, Lahiri Mahashaya wasn't attached to that body. It was just a vehicle for him. The rain falls, the dust falls, the wind blows on the body, but it does, and it's karma, you could say, for the rain to fall on that body, or sometimes a brick that it falls on the body, but it wasn't his karma. It may have been the karma of the disciple to be able to participate in that little lesson, or maybe it was the brick's karma. I don't know if bricks have karma, I don't think so. But but it wasn't Lahiri Mahashaya, as you see, because that body was not something that he was identified with. It was merely a vehicle for him. Lahiri Mahashaya had found long ago, I'm sure, because Lahiri Mahashaya, of course, was a master from many previous lifetimes, King Janaka, Kabir, and so on. But he had, in those lifetimes, discovered the secret of karma, which was to transcend it. Transcend the ego. Karma rules in this physical world, but we don't have to participate with it in that sense of ego attachment to it. Karma will come, and you can avoid it and hold it off and perhaps that you make a strategic decision if you want to do that. But it comes, and I think this is the higher way, is to allow the karma to come that is rightfully yours, and then to deal with it, to respond to it. And how you respond to it will be dependent upon your level of awareness. If you're a joyful soul, the karma comes, and it's just a little gnat or a mosquito bothering you. If you're not a joyful person, that same karma, oh my God, oh my God, it's terrible. It's terrible for you. Sister Gyanamata once said, he said, she was praying, and she prayed and prayed to God, and she saw something coming to her, karmically coming to her in life. And she prayed to God, says, change nothing, Lord, change no circumstance in my life, change me. In other words, may my ability, outward circumstances come, they come, and we can spend our life trying to change those circumstances that are coming to us. But more useful is to change ourselves so that we might be able to respond to whatever comes to us in the highest level possible. Now, this does not mean being passive. It doesn't mean jumping out of the way of the car that's about to run over you. That reminds me of that story of the mahout on the elephant, and that the man had heard that he says, well, just God's will, God will protect you, just to put your faith in God. So he was walking down the jungle path. It was very narrow, and he went a little bit, and he looks ahead, and there's an elephant charging out of control, charging down this narrow path at him with the mahout on top, saying, get out of the way, get out of the way. And the man thought, well, God is in me, God is in the elephant, this is what's coming, certainly God will protect me. And so the elephant comes, grabs the man with his trunks, tosses him aside and onto the roadside and charges on. And the man's all beat up and so on. And he goes to his guru and says, I don't understand what happened. God was in me, God was in the, why wasn't I not protected? And the guru says, well, you see, yes, God is in you. God is in the elephant. But God was also in the mahout telling you to get out of the way, and you didn't listen. Well, so consequently, I was saying at another satsang, saintliness is not dumbness. We don't want to mistake that. We have to use our common sense. But when we see circumstances coming, do the appropriate thing. But the most important thing is to change our attitude. Change our attitude. Now, somebody is in this topic of good karma, bad karma. I see somebody had sent in a question, which I'm happy to receive questions, by the way, if you send them in. Is our difficulty in forgiving others bad karma? I would ask you, is your difficulty good karma or bad karma? Difficulty, if you define it, it's a difficulty, so it's something, it's a lesson that you haven't learned yet. You haven't learned to be able to forgive others. And is it bad karma? It's something that you have not yet, you might say it's a bad habit or a trait that you have yet to overcome. Certainly your inability to forgive other people, it may have some impact on those other people, because I think forgiving other people does have benefit to others because it brings harmony, it brings people in peace, and they can feel that. They can feel your love. When you love other people, it helps other people. It's a blessing. But who is the one that is going to suffer in the long run from your lack of ability to forgive another? What it is when you lack forgiveness, you're holding a grudge. You're holding a grudge, and it's like carrying a heavy burden. Now, if you want to carry that heavy burden, that's your choice, but I would recommend that life is a lot easier to let go of that burden. It's not for the other person's sake, although it's nice to think that would be helpful to the other person as well, because it smooths their way a little bit, but it's mostly for your own sake. Now, you have formed that habit or that attitude somewhere in the past. Now, it's come to you. If you're seeing it in this lifetime now, that's good, because to be able to see a habit like that, and you're recognizing, and you recognize it as a difficulty, that's good, because you're aware that it's not something positive for you. And so consequently, now you can do something for you. So in a sense, your ability to see it is good. Now, what are you going to do about it? So is it good karma, bad karma? the fact that you can recognize it is good. That the fact that it's a burden is just, it just is. It's a burden that you now have to deal with. If it makes you stronger in the process by recognizing now that you can overcome it, the fact that you saw it is for your benefit. So I would take it that way. Take it that way. And it's not really. The karma is action. It's, if you have that attitude, how are you going to act upon it? And that's when you put things into motion. If you act from a grudge or hard feelings, you're going to then have to receive that back in some fashion. And so consequently, don't do that. Change it now, and you'll find that you can be free of it very quickly. If you put energy into it, of course, you see, that's the trick. You have to put energy, you have to use your will, you have to rise up to substitute a positive for that negative habit. Love is the antidote for holding grudges, forgiving people, being able to see that another person is the same soul that is in you, that is manifesting in you, that same God that's manifesting in you is also manifesting in another. And to hold a grudge against somebody else is to see that you and that other person are separate, when the reality is that you're not. So you're just affirming an untruth when you behave that way. And plus, just very practical sense, you'll feel a lot better if you can learn to forgive other people. The importance of right attitude on the spiritual life is so critical, and it changes the dynamic. No karma is inherently bad. It's bad if it takes you away from your divine goal, just like we spoke about in chapter 2. What's right action? Right action is that which takes us towards our goal, which is freedom. Wrong action is that which takes us away from our goal. Those things that impede our ability and to go toward our goal and pull us in the wrong direction, you could say that's bad karma. Those things that help us go toward our goal, you could define those as good karma. So I would ask you, so look inside yourself. Do you think forgiving somebody is having the opportunity to forgive somebody and acting upon it, that may be a good opportunity for you? Now, meditation as a tool, I'd like to just bring that up. Meditation is a wonderful tool for dissolving our karma. This is why we meditate. In Kriya Yoga, we speak about through the process of Kriya, we're very quickly be able to burn up, you could say, the seeds of karma through the Kriya practice of using the pranayama, the Kriya practice. But many of you I know are not Kriya bonds, but just the action of meditation itself dissolves karma. And why? Why does it dissolve karma? Remember when we started this discussion, action is, there's no such thing as inaction as long as we are identified as I am the doer. That in the sense that the vortex of my of action is revolving, my energy is revolving around that central pole of the ego. And when we meditate, we begin to dissolve that vortex. It softens that vortex. And we begin to understand that I am not the doer. I am not the doer, but action is happening through me. In the end, we understand that it's God is the doer. God is acting through us. And if we cooperate with that we feel that I am an instrument for action passing through me, just as Lahiri was. He was not identified with that body. Things were happening and they happened through him at that time. And this is the attitude of a master. The action passes through them. And when we meditate, we're attuning ourselves to that higher reality. When we meditate, we feel joy. Joy is an expression of the divine. And to the degree that we can attune ourselves with joy, we begin to become an instrument of that joy. And we then find that less and less are we acting from ego motivation, but we're attuning ourselves to acting, it's God's motivation. Joy is motivating us, not the individual ego. And so this is the path of meditation, and this is the path of Kriya Yoga. In Kriya, we take that a little bit more dynamically, and we begin to burn up, as they say, the seeds of karma. We burn those seeds of karma in the fire of divine love, in the fire of divine joy. We offer those seeds into that joy. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to write them now. If you don't have questions, we're going to conclude. I see one coming in. My assistant here is writing it for me. Okay. If you move aside, I can see. What are ways we can know God's will during tests? That's a good question. Tests will come. You're probably knowing that tests, there's no test too great for us that we can't overcome. And when we see something as a test, by the very word that you're using, challenges or tests, I remember a saying that it was a saintly saying. I'm not sure if it was one of our masters, but he says, don't pray for an easy life. Pray for the strengths to overcome your tests and challenges. So this is what we we don't want life to be easy, life in that sense, because if we see everything that comes to us, there's a little bit of resistance to it coming to us, and that's what makes it a challenge, or that's what makes it a test. Our job is to respond to it. Now, in yoga, I mentioned there's karma is action and reaction. What is the motivation and what is your attitude when you're reacting to something? Or you might say, what's the difference between reacting to something and responding to something? Reaction is emotionally reacting. Something happens and you react to it without thinking. You react to it from a sense of from anger. You react to it out of fear, perhaps, or some other negative emotion. If that's your motivation, and your motivation is not sattvic or highly of a higher consciousness, then you know that that's simply going to swing the pendulum back and forth again and again. One person is angry at you, so you get even and avenge it, and you're angry at him, do an action, and back and forth. But if you can learn to slow down the movement or the swing of that pendulum, this is the direction that you want to go. Now, how do you know if it's God's will? How do you know God's will in any action? You can feel it intuitively in your heart. If whatever you're doing, if you're acting from personal involvement and attachment to your actions, to the degree that you're attached egoically to your actions, there's a certain amount of egoic involvement with it. If you're completely non-attached and you're doing things that are not ego motivated, then that's more in attunement with God's will. But now your question is, how do you know the difference between ego action and God's will? This takes experience. In the sense, you might ask yourself, if you have time to contemplate your reaction to something, hold it up in your mind's eye, or if you're meditating, hold it up and ask the question, if I do this, how would I feel? And then feel in your heart. In other words, if you want to take a certain direction in this way and say, yes, I'm going to do this response, how do you feel? Do you feel free? Or do you feel, oh no, I don't want to do that? And then hold up another possibility. Hold these possibilities up into the spiritual eye and then feel what your reaction is. Do you feel joy? Do you feel calmness? Do you feel peace? Or do you feel anxiety? Do you feel, is there tension there? Is there a disturbance there? What is, you want to be reacting and following your inner guidance, a feeling of peace and with a feeling of divine rightness to whatever it is you're doing. In terms of day-to-day action, my guideline is if I can feel joy in what I'm doing. Joy, you see, is an aspect of the divine. If I can feel joy, peace, calmness, or love, one of those feelings in my heart, in my decision of whatever direction I'm taking in my action, those are divine qualities. And if you can act in the consciousness of those qualities, you're more likely to be on the right track. Now, these take experience, because in order to know if you're acting in joy, you have had to have had the experience of joy. You have to know what peace feels like. You have to know what it feels like to be calm. And this is why we meditate, to contact these states of consciousness. And then as we come out of meditation, to act in that consciousness in our day-to-day activities. If in the midst of the test that comes to you, if you can recall the peace that you felt in meditation and act in that peace, you're much more likely to respond rather than react. You're much more likely to response, by the way, as opposed to reaction, is a considered response. You see, you're responding appropriately rather than emotionally reacting. Reaction tends to come from more of a subprimal part of the brain, fear, anger, flight, whereas response tends to be something that comes from more the more developed part of the brain. Yes, this seems like it's the right direction to go. So is it a considered reaction, which might be a response, or is it an emotional reaction? But if you can also, in the midst of making a decision, recall that state that you've contacted previously in meditation of peace, love, or some manifestation, perhaps maybe not love, but maybe kindness, or charity, or expansion, or inclusiveness, or compassion. Some of these positive qualities that are expressions of love, if you can feel those and recall those and act in that consciousness, you're more likely to be on the right track, as opposed to negative feelings. What is your feelings when you're about to make a reaction or a response to some test that has come to you? And if you act in that way, I think you're going to be on the right track. But you act, you consider, you act again, you consider, you act, you consider, and it's a flow. It's not a one-time decision. You act in a flow of right guidance, not just one time, because guidance may take you in one direction, but it then may want to correct and go in another direction. So you must be continually looking for that right direction as a flow during your day, not in simply once and that's it. Any other further questions, please send them in. Otherwise, we're going to come back next week and we're going to continue this discussion. We left off on stanza 9 of chapter 3, and so if you'd like to study ahead, you can see that Swami Kriyananda in his Gita interpretations now goes into a discussion of directionality. And so we're going to be discussing directionality. What takes us in the right direction? We've talked about it already in terms of direction, in terms of determining what the right actions are. And now we're going to go a little bit more deeply into it, and then we'll proceed with the Gita stanzas 10 and onward.